I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, but I recognise that that might be different for different people depending on where we're located. So I would like to pay my respect and also ours as a collective to the elders past and present and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. All right, so the talk that I'm going to be presenting on today is the who, what, when, where, and hows of addressing loneliness in cerebral palsy. Given the title, I'm very interested in loneliness, and I think this is something that a lot of people can connect with, especially given the pandemic that we've just faced. But some people might not be able to express this to their greatest extent, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So, what is loneliness? Well, loneliness is quite a common experience that we feel. It's a subjective negative emotional experience that happens when people have a discrepancy between their desired and actual relationships. Sometimes though, people think it's the same as social isolation or being alone, but they are quite different. You can feel lonely even when you are surrounded by a bunch of people, or you can feel really well connected when you're alone. So it kind of happens irrespective of the number of people, because it is that subjective feeling that maybe there's a disconnection between you and other people. Loneliness is also quite a common and normal experience faced by almost everybody on this planet at some stage in their life. We might recognize this as like a transient feeling or experience that we're missing out on seeing our friends. And often this can happen on a Friday night where we might be at home because we can't afford to go out or something like that. And we see our friends on social media doing things and enjoying life. Obviously pre-pandemic, but that's easily remedied with like a phone call to a friend or family member. But loneliness can become problematic when it's not so fleeting and when it's a bit more chronic. And that's when it has implications for our physical and mental health. So when is loneliness likely to occur? Well, typically loneliness occurs during times of transition. So it might be when we are going from school to moving out by ourselves as adults, or it might be when we're retiring. It can happen all throughout our lifespan. But when it's most likely to occur for people with cerebral palsy are probably things that are a little bit more unique. For example, it might be changes to the school environment. So this could be changes from a primary to secondary school, or maybe even secondary to tertiary schools. But it could also be from a mainstream school to a specialist school, where you might feel that you're a bit disconnected from the people around you because they're not so familiar with you and you're not so familiar with them. Loneliness might also occur at times where our health becomes a little bit worse, or our capacity to do things becomes a little bit more disrupted. And this can feel like we are a little bit more disconnected from the people around us. And for people with cerebral palsy, changes to our supporting teams and our support workers might also be something that impacts, I guess, how we feel and how we connect with people around us. So it's quite common for young people with cerebral palsy to build a relationship and connection with the people who are supporting them. And when there are changes to that, it can very much feel like there is a disruption to our social network and how connected we feel with others. And this is typically because there's a lot of conversations that happen and people get to know each other over time. But when they change, you can almost feel like you're starting from point blank again. And then another important aspect where loneliness might sort of sneak in is when there's a transition from pediatric health services to managing the general health service as an adult. As a pediatric sort of support center, I guess there's a lot of people who will have regular contact with pediatricians or occupational therapists or speech pathologists. And I think this is something that's really important to recognize because it gives you constant contact with people who know you and can recognize signs of when you're withdrawing and stuff like that. But when you go into an adult service, or when you're managing and experiencing just general healthcare by yourself, you kind of have to tell your story again and go through those processes of answering questions that you've answered many times, or questions that you haven't had to answer because people know you so well. That can feel really isolating and, like, again, causing that sense of disconnection between people. So then, who is likely to experience problematic levels of loneliness? The general thing, the point that I want to make in this first slide is that it is common and it is a very normal experience that people feel. But in the general Australian population, it's about 1 in 4 people who experience problematic levels of loneliness. But in terms of people who have a physical disability, about 25% of people as well report not having anyone to talk to and are at risk of feeling lonely and being very socially isolated. So this includes people with CP, but it's not solely people with CP. And that's because a lot of the research out there today is really limited in how focal it is with loneliness and CP. There are a handful of studies, and what we see there is that people with CP do report higher levels of loneliness than the general population. I've got here 3 sort of sections there of, I guess, risk factors that are associated with loneliness. The first is social isolation. And as I mentioned, they are quite different. Social isolation and loneliness are quite different, but they are very much linked. So people who tend to be more socially isolated don't have the opportunities to engage with people as readily. And this can have an impact on how lonely a person feels. The second is a chronic health condition. So people with a chronic health condition can often feel like there is a disconnection between themselves and their peers and people around them. And this is typically because there's this perception that people don't understand what they're going through. And then another factor here that I wanted to raise is employment, or rather being unemployed. Going to work and being employed offers unique opportunities to connect with people who have a shared interest. And this is really important because it gives us an opportunity to discuss and strengthen or establish relationships that we otherwise wouldn't. Now, the concerning thing about these 3 factors is that in people with cerebral palsy, they tend to be, the research shows or suggests that they tend to be more socially isolated. They have chronic health conditions. In the very nature, CP is a chronic condition. And people with CP tend to be unemployed more so than the general population. So there seems to be this increase in risk factors for people with CP that we need to sort of work through and address. But the question remains, why do we need to target loneliness? And why do we need to target loneliness in cerebral palsy? Well, there's 4 sort of reasons why, I guess. The first is loneliness is really predictive of some common mental health concerns, particularly depression and social anxiety. So if we know that we're experiencing chronic levels of loneliness, or perhaps it's multiple instances of transient loneliness that we feel a little bit uncomfortable, we know that this can predict instances of depression, social anxiety, paranoia, and have an impact on our psychological well-being as well. We also know that chronic levels of loneliness are associated with physical health complaints. And these are things like hypertension, it might be things like increased heart rate, respiratory rate, but also morbidities with other sort of physical health conditions. And we know in people with cerebral palsy that there are a range of comorbid physical and mental health factors at play, which can really impact how a person can live their life and the impact of the quality of life. So given that, and then also the high morbidity and mortality rates of chronic loneliness, it's really important that we are able to address these concerns early on to almost prevent more comorbidities occurring and more physical and mental health impacts happening later in life for people with cerebral palsy. But how do we address this? I think that's the big question that a lot of people seem to ask, at least what I've been asked quite a lot, is how do we address loneliness? And the first point that I'll really highlight is that to understand or to address loneliness, you really need to understand what it is that you're feeling lonely about? For one person, it might be that they can recognize they haven't been able to make contact with people or haven't spoken to other people outside of their family unit, and they're really missing that. So recognizing that they might need some extra connections with people is a really nice way to remedy this. And so by understanding your level of loneliness or why you're feeling lonely, almost normalizes that it is okay to be lonely. And that's a really important first step, I think. The second point here is focus within your network. I think often when people think about making connections and strengthening or establishing new relationships, that they think about making new friends outside of their current circle. But that is really challenging. So what a first step might be, which might be really helpful, is to focus on strengthening the relationships that we already have. So this might be with family members, it might also be with colleagues that we might have, or it might be people in a peer group, really trying to use the foundations that we have in place to build upon. It's quite important. The other thing that we can do is rely on our strengths. So everybody has strengths, whether we can recognize them or not. And I have a survey that we can use to identify our own strengths that I'm happy to circulate around if people want. But it's a really useful tool to figure out what it is that you're quite good at, or that you have a good sort of understanding about yourself with. And then we can use those strengths to establish connections with other people and really build upon that. So if you know that you're a really funny person, you can use jokes and humor to establish connections with people. Similarly, I guess finding people who are similar to you is really important. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about work and being employed and the opportunities that that affords. If we find people that we have shared interests with, it's a really, really important way for us to recognize that we have something else to lean on. So it might be that we enjoy swimming and we like exercising. And so going and finding groups where we can actually talk about that is actually really helpful, because you already know that there's something that you can share there. And this leads into, I guess, using digital solutions to do this. So if we were to use social media or an app, we can reach people who have similar interests to extend and establish connections with. So this might be particularly useful for people with complex communication needs, or who might use augmentative and alternative communication devices. I've thrown a lot of information at you here, so I'm very mindful of the time as well, but I do have some, I am open to answering any questions. If there's some things on here that might take a little bit longer than expected, I have my contact details down below. And if you would like access to the strength survey that I highlighted earlier to try to figure out what your strengths are, I can also send that through as well. But we might put this over now to Ian.